How you doing, everyone? And welcome to Direct Dreadnought Gundam and More on PS4. And welcome back to the Legendary Journey series. And in this installment, we'll be looking at the most iconic ship of the Dreadnought game, and that would be the Dreadnought itself. Everyone loves Dreadnoughts, but not necessarily loves to play Dreadnoughts. Dreadnoughts are the tank of the game and can sustain a lot of punishment and can also give back a lot of firepower. But like many of the great battleships and carriers of the 20th century in real life, Dreadnoughts are incredibly vulnerable to raiding ships and destroyers. The mighty Bismarck was brought down by a biplane with a torpedo. The mighty Taiho carrier was done in by a humble U.S. submarine. So, we have all been in the situation in which we have been absorbing all the firepower, being the tank, taking out destroyers that have strayed too close, nailing tactical cruisers and artillery cruisers with nukes, but we've also been on the receiving end, being disrupted and then taken out by a destroyer ram or died to a little Corvette underneath us that we did not notice and just piled on the damage while we were heroically fighting the entire enemy team. So, Dreadnoughts are fairly realistic in that regard. They can take a lot of punishment, but are also incredibly vulnerable and very easy to hit. And that kind of limits their strategic options and their tactical flexibility. Unlike other ships, Dreadnoughts really do operate along the same lines, even the jumping versions. They're still there for the same purpose, and they still have the same kind of modules they use against the enemy. The destroyers diverge pretty much at Tier 4, where each one has a particular way of doing its main tactical purpose. The artillery cruisers are all strategically the same, but operate very differently from each other. The tactical cruisers even have a huge difference between Jupiter Arms and the other two companies. And of course, the corvettes, although like the destroyers having the same purpose, operate very differently from each other. But Dreadnoughts, even though there are some differences from the three mega corporations, pretty much operate the same way, whether they are tanking with modules, speeding around the battlefield, or jumping around the battlefield. When they actually get into the thick of combat, they are all doing the same thing. So, I want to make some recommendations before we jump in to the legendary journey on Dreadnoughts. And the first one is, go ahead, play through the Smargel and the Nav, the Tier 1, Tier 2 Dreadnoughts, the only Tier 1, Tier 2 Dreadnoughts available in the game. Go ahead, play through those, because the lessons you learn in lower tier gameplay for Dreadnoughts will carry with you through Tier 3 to Tier 5. They really will. Every other ship, you can, even if you never touched a Jupiter Arms destroyer, if you jump into the Dola or the Vindicta, you can use that mega corporation's tech tree and the experience you gain from other ships in that tech tree to learn how to operate that ship effectively. But all the Dreadnoughts have lessons that they can learn from the Smargel and the Nav, and they're not very hard to get through at all. And more importantly, you get a very important officer briefing with the Chernabog. And now let's get into my second point, officer briefings. Every other ship class in the game, save Dreadnoughts, can get by without officer briefings. Officer briefings will enhance your gameplay, and specific ones for specific ship builds will really boost your gameplay and give you an edge on a comparable captain in a comparable ship that does not have access to those officer briefings. But they will not be the staple of your gameplay. They will not be the thing that conquers all. You can still get by 99% of the time without specific officer briefings on most ships. Some ships do rely a little bit more on officer briefings than others, but especially destroyers, artillery cruisers, you really can get by without a lot of officer briefings. Dreadnoughts are the exception. If you want really good Dreadnought gameplay, if you want to be competitive even at only an average level in veteran, and if you want to survive legendary gameplay, you need 3 officer briefings in particular. 2 are essential, 1 is a bonus, but you really need those. And let me tell you from my experience, and those of you who know me know that I don't fool around. When I'm on the battlefield and I start shooting a tier 4 Dreadnought in legendary mode, if I do not see the telltale marks of specific officer briefings on your Dreadnought, if I don't see the little green clock, if I don't see the little green shield, and I don't see the little green energy lightning bolt, I'm going to redouble my efforts to put you down, because I know that you are going to be much easier to take down than another Dreadnought whose captain I know is a good Dreadnought captain, or they have all 3 of those telltale marks of officer briefings. I am probably going to reassess my situation before moving in on those Dreadnoughts, whereas if I attack you and you do not have the hallmarks of specific officer briefings on your Dreadnought, I am going to double my efforts and attack you much more viciously, because I know I'm going to put you down quicker and be able to move on to my next target. And that's very important. So the first officer briefing that we're going to look at happens to be on the Chernabog. And the Chernabog, of course, is the tier 3 Aquila Vector Dreadnought. And a fine Dreadnought it is. Also, like with destroyers and most other ships, tier 3 is where we start branching into the other competitor for the mega corporations in that specific ship class. And of course, later on at tier 4, we are going to be introduced to the third mega corporation's introduction to complete the set of 3 Dreadnoughts in this particular class. But let's take a look at the Chernabog. The Chernabog is, of course, a higher tier version of what most players are used to when they play the tier 1, tier 2 version of the Dreadnought. And we're not going to get into tier 1, tier 2 because the legendary journey really starts at tier 3. This is where you get enough modules to decide how you're going to play, what direction you're going to take, and what is the best way to find either game meta that will accelerate your experience and progression into tier 4 and tier 5, or you get a flavor of whether or not you like specific styles of Dreadnought play, whether you want to individualize that or whether you want to dump the Dreadnought and get into another ship. So right now we are first going to look at slow and steady. This is one of the few officer briefings available at tier 3, and this is an instant pickup. As soon as you get the Chernabog, you need to be getting slow and steady. And besides learning lessons from the Aquila Vector tree in tier 1 and tier 2 for Dreadnought gameplay, you want to get the Chernabog at least to get slow and steady if you want to use Dreadnoughts from other mega corporations. So if you're a serious Dreadnought captain, you want at least the Chernabog in Aquila Vector. Even if you can't stand Aquila Vector ships, you need this officer briefing. Now many of you are going to say, but Math, I hate that Dreadnoughts are slow. Shouldn't I want to make them faster? And with the officer briefing, Engines 101 for your speed buff, your basic speed officer briefing, if you actually do the math, adding 10% to your speed, which for the Chernabog is 34, 35, I believe it's 35, you're going to be adding, rounded down, plus 10%, which is 3, bringing your speed to 38. Which isn't that big of a deal. It's not such a big difference. And when you add other officer briefings that enhance speed, you're really not getting much out of the deal. And for a lot of games, Dreadnought included, I believe in the philosophy of min-max. And what that means is you should be putting speed bonuses on your fastest ship, armor bonuses on your heavily armored ship, and attack bonuses on your highest attacking ship. I know that I also believe in the philosophy of being tactically flexible and kind of a jack of all trades, but when you're talking about officer briefings, you want to enhance what you're good at, and if you want to detract something, detract from the thing you're worst at, because you can put turbo on a golf cart, but it's still never going to beat a Dodge Viper. You know, if you want to put a turbo on something, put the turbo on the Dodge Viper. If you want to put a car refrigerator in something, don't put it in the Dodge Viper, put it in your golf cart so you can have a beer when you go golfing. That's the idea, that's the philosophy. So by subtracting 10%, you're dropping from 35 down to 32 or 33, which is not really noticeable in game, and you're gaining plus 10% damage resistance. And damage resistance is one of the most important things in the game. Damage resistance, bypassing shields, bypassing anything else, you never have to worry about it. It's passive, and it reduces the amount of damage that you're taking. And it isn't unstackable. So if someone is adding damage, percentage damage, to the amount of damage they're doing to you, your damage resistance applies afterwards. And if you do the math on that, if someone's doing double damage but your resistance is 80%, you are taking significantly less damage. It does not even out at all. So it's a real disadvantage for those people buffing their damage, because when it comes down to it, when you're buffing your damage to 300% and they're only taking 5% of what damage you're dishing out, it's still not even going to be 1,000 points per hit. So the idea with slow and steady is you're losing a little bit of speed, but when you stack this with the armor amplifier bonus and you also apply things like Engineering 101, you are achieving the 96% threshold in Tier 5 for invulnerability. You want that perfect threshold where you're not wasting damage resistance or defensive buffs, but you are as close to invulnerable as the game allows by only using one module or two modules in conjunction. So really slow and steady gives you the maximum bang for your buck, and it's an easy pickup at Tier 3, and it's the first thing you want to have at the Chernabog. The second officer briefing we are going to get into is, of course, Retaliator, but we'll get into Retaliator when we take a look at the Jutland. The third officer briefing, that is the bonus officer briefing, is found in the Jupiter Arms tech tree, and that is Get My Good Side, which is found on the Machias Corvette. This is a really good officer briefing, one of the few that are available at Tier 3, and in my opinion, it's worth getting because I've done the play testing, I've tried to crunch the numbers, and it really does benefit you more than Engineering 101, but Engineering 101 is still a really, really good officer briefing to have on Dreadnoughts if you don't want to go through the Jupiter Arms Corvette line to get the Tier 3 Machias and then get My Good Side. But Get My Good Side, what it does is if you take damage to either of your sides, and most of the Dreadnoughts are pretty big and pretty long, so especially if you're using broadsides, if you go in there and make the 90-degree turn, or even really a 30-degree turn, enough so that you're taking damage off your bow, off your stern, and taking it anywhere down the center 60% of your ship on either side, you get 1 point of energy for every 400 hull damage you take, which sounds like a lot, but it really isn't. It adds up quickly. You take 10,000 damage from a couple artillery shots, and you got yourself a big chunk of energy to put back into shields. And the great thing about it is it works whether your shields are on or off. If your shields go down and you're in a bad spot, you'll get a whole bunch of energy as you take damage, which is really good. Or if your shields are already up and only a little bit of damage is bleeding through, you're going to get a point here and a point there as damage bleeds through your shields, and it's going to help keep your shields up. And I calculated this once at about 23% longer. So I think that's very effective. Those are the officer briefings you really want. And if you don't have them on your Dreadnought, it's going to make you that much bigger of a target to those in the know, those with experience. And those three particular officer briefings are really going to enhance your gameplay. And I can't stress that enough. So let's take a look at the Chernabog now. After you pick up slow and steady and put that on your ship, you're going to want to choose your primary and secondary modules. Now, you're used to the plasma broadside and the nuclear missile from Tier 1, Tier 2, and that is great. And those are always going to be really good modules for you to take. They're two completely different philosophies, but I'm telling you now, people still use these two particular modules in Tier 5 and love every minute of it. The nuclear missile, of course, is using it roughly once every minute, minute and a half, and you're using this strategically to really take down all the debris that tactical cruisers leave on the battlefield to give everyone a hard time, like artillery pods and healing pods, to do a lot of damage in the ultimate spike attack to really hard to kill ships with low hit points, such as corvettes who happen to be flying by without their shields on, or tactical cruisers, or artillery cruisers who have been bothering you at long range and you just can't get a beat on them with your guns. Nuclear missile will handle it, but it is a temperamental weapon, and if everyone knows it's coming with the missile alarm, they are going to throw up their shield, so don't expect the nuclear missile to come through every time. But if you use it right, it can give you a window of opportunity to get in there or get out, or it can change the tide of battle if the nuke hits at the right moment. Plasma broadside is the complete opposite philosophy, and that is, I want to get in there, I want to do consistent damage, I don't want to roll the dice with the nuke. Especially with Retaliator, all the broadsides can be halved as far as their cooldown, but even without Retaliator, before you get Retaliator, it's got a very low cooldown. If you stay between 1,000 to 3,000 meters of your target, you're going to be able to use most broadsides, and they do very good spike damage, and you can hang on to them and wait for the right moment to strike even corvettes, or if you're pounding it out with another Dreadnought, you can just keep tapping the button as soon as the cooldown is off and just keep piling on damage with your primary and secondary guns and your secondary module, and just outlast them with defensive bonuses. So these are pickups you want to take into Tier 4, definitely. Tartarus missile, I definitely recommend. This is the thing you want to take in with you to Tier 4, but you don't want to use it on your casual builds. You really want to use it on team builds. It requires coordination to use effectively. A lot of times I've been hit by a Tartarus missile, and I was hit by a Tartarus missile, and I continue to do my thing and kill people, especially in an artillery cruiser. Really, unless there's a follow-up, it makes no difference to me. You took away my ability to do stuff except shoot for a period of like 10 seconds. So for those 10 seconds, I shot you. Okay, so the Tartarus missile needs follow-up. You need to hit a really annoying target with it, and then have your fellow teammates coordinate with you and follow up and take the target out. So in team or squad-oriented matches or contests, you want the Tartarus missile. So it's worth taking with you into Tier 4, even if you have your prerequisite of modules necessary to get the Voronezh. I would make sure you pick up the Tartarus missile on the way to Tier 4, because they're very useful. Even a Tier 3 Tartarus missile, when used right, can take out a bad guy if you have help. Scattergun broadside. I don't like the scattergun broadside. Ballistic broadside is much better for what it does. You have to get so close with this thing to use it that there's really no point. Even a jumping Dreadnought, which we'll get into later on with Jupiter Arms, they're really not going to benefit from scattergun broadside as much. So I would pass this by. If you really want to try it out, go ahead, but it's not worth it. If you really want close range firepower, you want the heavy flak turrets. Now, it used to be that the repeater guns were the way to go, because the repeater guns were better than everyone's primary guns in their Dreadnoughts. But a couple months ago, Greybox saw the flaw in this and fixed this, so everyone's primary guns on their Dreadnoughts are more effective than their secondary weapons, which is the way it really should be. So, really, repeater guns, they're pretty good on the Chernabog. You want to pick them up because the Chernabog and all the Kula Vector Dreadnoughts, they have very long range, very high power hit on their main guns, but they're very slow, and unless you're an expert, they're notoriously hard to track fast-moving targets. So, sometimes when you close into that middle range and even close range, the repeater guns are really good for just adding quick easy to hit damage, right? Just stacking it on. You hit them at long range with a couple lucky shots from the main guns. You get into medium range, hit them with the repeaters, and then when your repeaters are out of ammo, you can go back to the main guns really quick and deliver some really good firepower at close range where it's easier to hit them. However, the repeater guns do have a quick reload. The main guns in the Chernabog do not, so the repeater guns are also a good filler for in-between reloads for your primary weapons. But the heavy flak turrets are going to get better and better as you increase in tier, and if you really want some close range firepower and you start getting good with hitting fast moving or even slow moving targets with your main guns on Akula Vector Dreadnoughts, heavy flak turrets will deliver the punch at 1200 meters or less, let me tell you. And it's very deceiving. Their average DPS doesn't seem like it's that much better than the repeaters or the primary weapon on Akula Vector Dreadnoughts or any Dreadnoughts really. But the average DPS rating that is shown in the UI, it's deceiving because the reload time is 5.62 seconds, which drags the average DPS down considerably. If you only use the 15 shots in your clip and then immediately switch to your primary weapon as the heavy flak turrets reload, that average DPS is going to go way up, let me tell you. And unlike destroyer flak, it actually reaches out to 1200 instead of just 1000. So if you want something at close range to deliver firepower and deter destroyers and corvettes, or pile on even more damage to victims you get the drop on, heavy flak turrets are quite useful and way better than scatter gun broadsides. So let's quickly look at the secondary module class here, and that would be the Vulture missile, the light torpedo, heavy torpedo, and flechettes. Now, I would recommend taking the Vulture missiles in with you to tier 4. The Vulture missiles are dependable. You're used to using them at tier 1 and tier 2. They do decent damage, but they really, their main benefit is they have a very long range, and their cooldown gets better over time as you increase in tier. But let me tell you, they travel slow. They also kind of arc around most terrain. They're really good at that, but they're still very slow. They're easy to shoot down. You launch them and forget about them. If they get a kill, that's great for you. If they don't, oh well. So mixed results on the Vulture missiles, but I would take them with you. I use them on particularly slow builds like my non-jumping Jutland and Monarch, my super brick builds. I do use them because they have the range and they do get the job done occasionally, but if you have something else in mind, I would pick them up, bring them with you into tier 4, but they're not game winners, that's for sure. Flechette missiles later on have advantages, but they get overshadowed by light missiles, and really the only time to use them is tier 3, and in tier 3 they're okay. They have a low cooldown, they chase down corvettes pretty good. Their range is really poor, but there's a lot of missiles, so they overwhelm missile defenses and they do decent damage. So if you already have Retaliator, Flechette missiles are really, really good because their cooldown, if you're in the thick of it and taking damage on your shields from all sorts of directions, your cooldown is going to be like 15 seconds for Flechettes. And if you've got tons of targets all around you, a target-rich environment, you're in the center of the havoc, the chaos, Flechette missiles, you're going to be launching them every 15 seconds at various targets and piling the damage on. At tier 3, though, unless you already have Retaliator, if you don't, at tier 3, Flechettes, just like the Vultures, they're the opposite of the Vultures, and they're only useful half the time. The real hard-hitting module in tier 3 for both the Dreadnoughts you're going to encounter in tier 3 are the light torpedoes. And you can even use light torpedoes in tier 4 and tier 5, but let me tell you, light torpedoes in tier 3 are savage. Look at the range on these things, 3,600 meters. That is excellent. Also, what is not put here is that light torpedoes do not trigger missile warnings. So you're going to go in there and a corvette's going to be harassing one of your friends, or you're going to sneak up on someone who thinks you're maybe 5,000 meters away and you're really 4,000, 3,600, or you're in the middle of a brawl and no one is paying attention, there's stuff going everywhere. These things are fairly hard to see and they sneak up on people when they least expect it. The light torpedoes deliver 13,200 damage, 3,600 meter range. It's got a big cooldown, but they even have a small blast radius. They're really, really mean, and people don't see it coming. You're going to get a lot of kills with light torpedoes. You just have to suffer through the long cooldown, but you're going to kill a lot of annoying corvettes. You're going to nail a lot of destroyers. You're going to nail a lot of tactical cruisers with the light torpedoes, and they get even better in Tier 4, Tier 5. Heavy torpedoes are awful, and they will be awful for the rest of the game. Me and Yuls and me and Blitznecro and a whole bunch of other players, we were trying to figure out what Greybox was thinking with the heavy torpedo, but they're slower than the light torpedoes. They do less damage than the light torpedoes. They have less range than the light torpedoes. They have less blast radius than the light torpedoes, and they have the same cooldown. They're worthless. Don't bother with them. And it's not like they have a sudden improvement in higher tiers. They are always worthless. Never take them. Please don't. Okay, so let's move into the proximity module slot for the Chernabog. We have heavy autoguns 2, moves into heavy autoguns 3. You start out with the heavy autoguns 2. They're all right. They have a good range. 1500 is really good for autoguns. Most autoguns are shorter range than that. They have an awful cooldown, fairly short duration. It doesn't get much better. Heavy autoguns 3 you might want to pick up just if you need a module to get to Tier 4, but I wouldn't make it part of your build. Tractor beam 3. Tractor beams are so annoying in Tier 5. Let me tell you, they're awful because they turn enemy ships towards you. It's funny when you get a poor Oberon corvette and a tractor beam because they're trying desperately to get away and they're fluttering all around like a moth around flame and they're trying to get away, and their interesting turn radius really is a detriment when it comes to the tractor beam. In Tier 3, the tractor beam, you can use it. It is good. People who aren't used to it, it will throw them off their game. It will drag them into broadside range. People who know about tractor beam, though, know that the tractor beam strength at Tier 3 is very low. So if you see it coming, if you know you're being drawn in by a tractor beam, you can turn away from it, use power to engines, use other modules to boost out of the tractor beam range, which is only 3,000 meters. But it is fun to use. It's not a game winner at Tier 3. At Tier 5, it's absolutely awful. Awful in a good way for you, awful for everyone else. When you're the victim of a tractor beam, it really, really sucks. So, tractor beams, really good at higher tiers. You may want to bring it in with you for practice, but not so good at Tier 3. Anti-missile lasers are solid. They will be solid until Tier 4. If you're in Tier 3 using anti-missile lasers, you could be using something better, and we'll get to that in a second. But it is fairly constant. You save up for it. Don't overuse it. Don't use it to protect your friends. Screw your friends. You need to protect you, okay? So the duration's only 20 seconds. It's got over a minute cooldown. But if you got a lot of missiles coming in, it's a lot of damage you don't have to take. It's okay. It does all right in Tier 4, but really, Tier 3 is the last chance you're going to get to use it. It'll be a good secondary build. If you know there's going to be a lot of missiles flying around, if you know there's an artillery cruiser out there that likes to use stasis missiles or something of the like, it's okay. It also takes care of other problems. It takes care of torpedoes you may not see coming. Refire rate's okay. 3 turrets firing. It's all right. You can do better. And how can you do better? Stasis pulse. This is the thing in Tier 3. Stasis pulse is still very powerful in Tier 4 and Tier 5, but stasis pulse in Tier 3 is complete murder. If you jump in, I'm not recommending you do a jumping build in Tier 3, or if you're a faster Dreadnought, and we'll get into that in a minute, stasis pulse is really vicious against corvettes. It's pretty interesting against destroyers who are trying to ram you. It's interesting with destroyers who jump away and you stasis pulse them before they get away, and then when they jump out, you have time to retrain your guns. It's a very useful module. If you're jumping Dreadnought in Tier 4, Tier 5, it's very good. I wouldn't recommend jumping in Tier 3, and I'll get into that in a sec. But Stasis Pulse, very useful, got a decent range, got a small cooldown. It's got 8 seconds. 8 seconds is more than enough time to get some damage from your guns and turn that big butt of yours around to get a broadside in. It's even enough time to set up for a nuke if you do the timing right. If you fire the nuke and you're doing a suicidal nuke, you're being crowded by a lot of enemies, you can throw the nuke out, save some of your shields, stasis pulse everybody, throw your shields up as your own nuke comes down, and it's a party. It's great. So it's a very useful module. I recommend it, and it also has uses in Tier 4, which is very important, so you definitely want to take this one with you. So now we're getting into the 3 internal modules for Tier 3. We have Offensive Lockdown. Just like with heavy torpedoes, never take this, never use this. You can try to use it and have a good game, and I will cast your game. If you use Offensive Lockdown in a match and get over 10 kills without dying, I will post your replay, I will cast it, and I will sing you high praises, and I will put the link in every social media thing I know. But you're not going to do it because it sucks. But anyway, it's just awful. It's hard to use, and it doesn't get better to use. And more importantly, it's taking away from what you could be using. So when you're using Offensive Lockdown, you're not using other modules that are way better. So no matter how good you get, if you use Offensive Lockdown, it's just, you're hurting yourself. You really are. You're bringing a Nerf foam sword to a gunfight. It's not worth it. You could be the best ninja and kill people with a foam Nerf sword, but you'd rather be using something else. Warp Jump 3. Warp Jump gets really, really, really good in Tier 5. It gets pretty good in Tier 4, but in Tier 3 it's going to get you in a lot of trouble. You can only target your allies. Otherwise, you're blind jumping, you're trying to estimate it. It's got a decent range, 5,000 meters. It's got a 6-second charge up, which takes forever, even in Tier 3, and a 30-second cooldown. 30 seconds is still pretty high, so Retaliator has a problem knocking it down. Charge up 6 seconds. It's not worth it. I'd pick it up just to take it into the next tier if you want to experiment, but it's not the way to go. The Chernabog has good movement, excellent armor, decent long-range firepower, good access to good, solid secondary weapons, and all the modules we just went over. The missing piece is armor amplifier. You can get into trouble and out of trouble using power to engines. You can depend on tacticals and other support from other ships. Deliver the long-range firepower and either deliver a nuke at long range or close in and use your broadsides. Either way, when you finally get into the thick of it, you want armor amplifier, and for probably 60 to 70% of all the good Dreadnought builds out there, you're using armor amplifier. Armor amplifier has been normalized across all tiers to deliver 80% resistance increase. It has a decent duration at 15 seconds. That's going to get better. It's got a decent cooldown at 33 seconds. That's going to get better with tier. But you incorporate Retaliator with that, and that's going to come online probably every 18 to 20 seconds. And when you add Slow and Steady, which is available on the Chernabog, there's no reason not to get it. Even if you don't want the Voronezh, you should really get that officer briefing. That brings it to 90% damage resistance, and the minute you put the 6.5% damage resistance from Engineering 101, you are now as close to invulnerable as Dreadnought allows. Therefore, you want armor amplifier. So that's the overview for the Chernabog, and the overview really for the core modules for Dreadnoughts in general. And you see probably about 5 of those modules we won't have to go over much in the future because they are staples of gameplay. We also took a look at the officer briefings, but now for Tier 3, let's take a look at the Oberon tech tree. And right here we see there's only one Dreadnought in the Oberon tech tree up until Tier 3, and that is the Gravis. The Gravis is a very, very interesting take on Dreadnoughts. It's essentially a light cruiser, if you will, like a light Dreadnought, and it's really, in a way, a heavy destroyer. It used to have really good guns, but now with some recent patches it has exceptional guns. It can reach out and shoot things at 7,000 meters, which is great, but it does kind of have a poor cone of fire at that range, so you're only tickling things, but you're still doing damage. As soon as you get into 5,000 meters or less is when the Gravis and Lorica and Invictus guns really start cranking out the damage. It's not nearly as good, but it's really getting to the point where it's almost as good as destroyer guns. Puts out a lot of damage. It has a very comparatively low reload time, and with certain officer briefings that can be increased. And it does really good damage at medium to short range because the cone of fire is reduced, and that big purple spray that it shoots out, just about all the rounds hit the target, which is great. As far as the repeater guns, they're just not as good as your main guns on the Gravis, and you really want to be using flak. That changed. It used to be you alternated between the two because the repeater guns did more damage, but in between repeater gun reloads you could use the primary weapons, the plasma cannons, on the Gravis and the Lorica. But with recent changes, heavy flak turrets are the way to go because you do not have the armor, you do not have the hull that a Akula Vector does to sustain a close encounter with a destroyer or corvette. You really want to get rid of them as quick as possible, or if you use terrain to your advantage, which you should be, and you're using the speed of the Gravis and the Lorica to your advantage, you can of course get in there and sneak up on a lot of opponents. I've done it. It's not too hard to do. Pretend you are an Akula Vector destroyer, hide behind a mountain, glide along at either 35 to 40 speed, get up there, do a surprise attack with your flak guns and broadsides. It's really good. There's two philosophies with Oberon Dreadnoughts. Now, they are faster. They are. And you can do some interesting things with that speed. But it's not a Vindicta. It's not a Brutus. You have maybe at the current tier you're at, you're typically going to be 4 to 5 maneuver rating points faster than Akula Vector, and way faster than anything Jupiter Arms has as far as Dreadnoughts go. But your real main competitor is going to be Akula Vector, and Akula Vector is only 4 to 5 points slower than you are, and they have approximately 50% more hull points. That's a lot. They typically have 50 to 60. You typically have 40 and top out at, I believe, 50. We'll take a look at that in a sec. But really, it enables you to get in and get out of trouble a little faster, and it has really good guns. You really want to stick at medium range. You have builds later on when you get Strikecraft that you can do long range, but you can use this thing to be a good mid-range support Dreadnought, and then when you see someone running away, you can track them down, kill them, finish them off, and then go back to your lines. Or you can use your guns at medium to long range and launch nukes, and if someone tries to chase you down, you have the speed to get away or at least get to other friendly ships that can help you. That's the philosophy. Don't think you're going to climb into an Oberon Dreadnought and be a speedster. There are certain builds that you can do that, but a lot of them just die fast. Okay, you have to be a really good captain to do that. What you can do is use armor boosting modules to get near invulnerability just like any other Dreadnought. And then when that wears off, make a hasty retreat while just spilling tons of firepower while you're backpedaling or while you're speeding away. So it also gets you into things faster. It's really hard for a Kula Vector to surprise someone without a jump drive. You can do it without a jump drive or even any kind of engine booster. I've seen it. It can be done. You can sneak on targets. And the Dreadnought is fairly small. It's just about the same size as a Kula Vector destroyer. So, it is an interesting game style. Of course, you have access to the plasma broadside if you're a mid-range brawler and you're sneaking in and out of close range and retreating and attacking and retreating. Plasma broadside's really good. Nukes are really good. Tartarus is pretty good too. If you're a support Dreadnought, you can go and bounce around from one flank to the other, helping out your team as they need it, and launch Tartarus missiles at anything your team is focus firing on. It's very useful. Stay away from scattergun broadside. Vulture missiles are a little better on Oberon Dreadnoughts because if you're trying to keep away from close range as much as possible, unless you have a definite advantage, you know, you're the bully Dreadnought. You're avoiding fights with other Dreadnoughts, but you want to get into fights with smaller ships. That's what you're doing. You're a fast Dreadnought. Vulture missiles will give you that long-range punch if you're trying to keep away from the enemies. Or you can sneak up on people. I've done this a lot. Sneak up on people, power to engines in your Oberon Dreadnought, launch light torpedoes. Don't shoot while you're doing this, and then giggle, hee, and then the light torpedoes hit, and they're like, whoa, where did I take all this damage? And then you finish them off with your plasma or your flak. It's great. Heavy torpedoes, stay away from. Flechettes, you have to close in too quickly. You don't want to be keeping at such a close range. I wouldn't go with flechettes, but light missiles later on, when we get into Tier 4, are pretty good. Anti-missile lasers, it's pretty good on Oberon. I mean, Stasis Pulse is really good on Oberon, more so arguably than a Kula Vector, because you can sneak up on someone and then Stasis Pulse them so they can't get away, and then unload your firepower and then run away if things go wrong. Or if someone's chasing you, Stasis Pulse them, power to engines, get away, give them the middle finger as you're leaving. Pretty darn good. But you're susceptible to concentrated missile and torpedo attacks, so if you have a secondary build with anti-missile lasers, that can be really good. I know everyone says, I have this plan, I'm going to go out and I'm going to speed along with the ultra-fast Oberon Dreadnought, and I'm going to use tractor beam to drag people, and then I'm going to fly away from the target. I'm dragging him with tractor beam to my friendly lines. It's going to be glorious. I'm going to be like Scorpion from Mortal Kombat. It's not going to work to Tier 5. Let me save you the problems. Let me save you the heartache. Tractor beam is no good until Tier 5. Don't do it at Tier 3. Don't do it. Stay away from it. Alright, heavy autoguns 3, don't do it. You have to close into close range. Stasis Pulse, very good. Anti-missile lasers, very good for certain matches. Warp jump, why? You're going to jump in and then get killed. And you're not going to jump out in time with 6 seconds. If you're at 20% life on a Gravis and you're trying to jump away with a 6-second charge time, you're not going to make it. Let me save you the heartache. You have the speed, use it. You want the warp jump on something that doesn't have the speed. You want armor amplifier. And you want slow and steady. Alright, so the Gravis is 39 speed rating. 10% rounded down, you're losing 3 speed. You're going to be at 36. That's almost as good as a Jupiter Arms Destroyer. Just shy of a Jupiter Arms Destroyer. That's fast enough. Put slow and steady on there. Get the 10% bonus. Then get Engineering 101 with the 6.5% bonus to damage resistance. Use armor amplifier. There you go. You're just as invulnerable as any other heavy Dreadnought for 15 seconds. And then when the 15 seconds is over, you won't be using your shields during that time. Your energy bar would have gone up. And then use power to engines to get away, or throw up your shields to absorb even more firepower. Very interesting Dreadnought. As far as Tier 3, I'm going to have to give it to the Gravis because of its tactical flexibility, but it's not as good at close range brawling as a Kula Vector. So it's almost a tie at Tier 3. 2 really good Dreadnoughts, but I'm going to have to give it to the Gravis. When you're in Tier 3, grab a Gravis, play with it. It's pretty good. Don't be reckless with it, but it's the most flexible a Dreadnought play is going to get at tier 3. But you can't go wrong with Aquila Vector for Dreadnoughts. They're pretty good too. Okay, so now that we've gone a complete overview on tier 3 and all the modules, let's go into tier 4. And now we're going to take a look at the Voronezh. We're going to take a look at the Lorica, and we're going to unlearn what we've learned with the Aquila Vector tier 1 and tier 2 Dreadnought to take a look at the Jupiter Arms Jutland, which really does change the way you think about Dreadnoughts. So let's get back to Aquila Vector in tier 4, and we have the Voronezh, and let me tell you, not much changes. The Voronezh has a little less speed, it has some more hull points, it's at 60,000, and it has slightly more powerful guns, but it's basically the same thing you get at tier 3, but for tier 4. The good news is that with the standardized 80% damage resistance for Armor Amplifier 4, which lasts 15 seconds and now has at tier 4 a lower cooldown at 30 seconds, coupled with Retaliator, means you are still just as competitive as a Zeme. With Armor Amplifier, unless you get disrupted, and by the way, Disruptor Pulse and Disruptor Missiles are your worst enemies, so sometimes if there's a lot of Brutuses out there with Disruptor Missiles, you may want to invest in a secondary build that has anti-missile lasers. There is a purpose for that. They're not as good as Destroyer anti-missile modules, but it does have a purpose. It can keep you alive if there's a lot of Brutuses, but usually that's the only time you want to use that particular module, but you really want to be using Armor Amplifier 4. Let's take a look at the Warp Jump. Now at tier 4, it targets allies and enemies, and that's very interesting, but at tier 4, you're not a Zeme. You don't have the higher amount of armor. You don't have the higher amount of hit points. If you want to jump in Aquila Vector, do it on the Zeme. On the Voronezh, you just need to get to tier 5. You want to clear these modules out. You want to get the experience and get the Zeme, and you're not at a disadvantage then. And the thing that's going to do that for you is Armor Amplifier. You're fast enough with the Voronezh. I've seen this right here with the Assault Thrusters 4, Assault Thrusters 5. I've seen some comedy of Aquila Vector Dreadnoughts who are just fast enough to use Assault Thrusters to get the drop on someone, and they speed around using Nerves of Steel and Assault Thrusters, and it's pure comedy. They get a lot of kills, and then they get to me, or they get to Scroat, or they get to Manny, or they get to Dr. Bree, or they get to Dude VT. They get to one of us, and we're like, that's great. I like that. I'm never going to try that build, though. Die. You know, it's comedy. It's good if you're bored. Put Assault Thrusters on there, play around with it. Take it into tier 5, if you will. That way you don't have to buy it in tier 5. You can focus on the really good modules. But Armor Amplifier is the way to go. There is an argument for this module right here, Endurance Mode. But Endurance Mode you definitely want to stay away from for Oberon. For the Voronezh, I've seen it used. It's okay. The problem I have with Endurance Mode is it lasts 60 seconds. For the last 30 seconds, it's really good. But for the first 20 seconds you put it on, if someone's not healing you, and you've already taken a lot of damage, and you activate Endurance Mode, that 200 health regeneration per second is not going to do anything for you. You are going to die. There's no way to save you. Endurance Mode is great when you activate it and you have good timing, maybe 30 seconds before you get into a fight, so you build up that stamina, build up that hull. Or if you have a dedicated healer following you around if you're in a squad. And that works out for them too, because that's just going to, they're not going to feel bad healing you, because they're going to get so much experience off you. If you're a healer following an Endurance Mode ship around, it's absolutely fabulous. You're going to get 1 million healing that match easily, and probably going to be in the top 3 slots. So it's a mutual symbiotic relationship. But really, you want Armor Amplifier for Aquila Vector. You've got the hull to absorb the punishment in between armor amplifiers. It's really good stuff. you really want to use it. So as far as rupture ammo, not on a Kula Vector, no. Warp jump, not really. Offensive lockdown, please throw that in the garbage and never ever look back. Assault thrusters only for pure comedy. Endurance mode only when you're working with a healer. Let's take a look now at the proximity slots. So we could use the anti-missile lasers if you're being bullied by Brutuses. Tractor beam is a little more powerful but still easy to escape from. You can pick it up, but I wouldn't count on it. Stasis pulse loses some of its luster, but it still has a purpose. If you have armor amplifier covering you, you have a lot of flexibility. You can still use stasis pulse. You can use your tier 3 stasis pulse if you're just starting out in tier 4 and you haven't picked up anything good yet. But tier 4 stasis pulse, it's okay. The auto guns, I'm not a big fan of auto guns on Dreadnoughts. You can't aim them. They have decent range. It seems like it'd be impressive to add to your firepower, but there's better things you could pick up. And the one I recommend, if you're not using stasis pulse and you're not using tractor beam or anti-missile lasers for your builds, especially, anti-missile lasers good for Brutuses or Vindictas in the match, enemy Vindictas. Stasis pulse good if you are starting the match and you take a look at the enemy team and see they're starting out with 3 Corvettes. Yeah, pull out your stasis pulse build. Tractor beam good for grabbing things. It's alright. It's got better range now, better strength, better duration. Armor booster pulse. This is a great module. It's so good to have it in tier 4. So personally, you can do what I used to do for all my Dreadnoughts, and I still do for many of them, is alternate these. Especially if you have Retaliator. Even if you don't, they time out very well with around a 30-second cooldown. The duration times out well. And Armor Booster Pulse, it's good to start with. The brawl is beginning. You've already flown to the center of the map. The brawl is beginning. Shots are being exchanged. Your shields are down to half. Throw up your Armor Booster Pulse. It helps keep any tacticals around you alive, especially if they're popping out healing pods. It helps keep some destroyers around you alive. It makes you take half damage. You throw your shields up and take a little more than half damage off of that. So you're really taking a little less than quarter damage. You're taking about 23% damage. You're taking even less if you have slow and steady up, which you should. And if you're using things like Get My Good Side, you're getting more energy to keep your shields up. But if you didn't get My Good Side and you have Engineering 101, you're still taking even less damage, and it's great. It winds up being about 15 to 20% of the damage you're taking as long as your shields are up. And when your shields run out or Armor Booster Pulse runs out, you throw on your Armor Amplifier and you take only 4% of the damage coming in. And then when that wears out, you get your shields back with Get My Good Side, or you didn't use your shields and took a little bit on the face unless you're in a desperate situation with Armor Amplifier. And then you get your Armor Booster Pulse back and you use that, and it's great. And it's a 1600 meter radius, 50% damage resistance. It's really good. It lasts between 15 to 18 seconds. It's very, very good. I highly recommend it. There are other alternatives, stasis pulse, anti-missile lasers. Highly recommended though, especially on the Voronezh. Now let's take a look at weaponry. Nothing much has changed except we have the addition of Strikecraft. Strikecraft are very useful. Not so much on a Kula Vector. You are slow and you're probably not jumping around. So you use it at the beginning of the match, but then you get into the middle of a brawl and everyone shoots them down because you're just in the thick of it. So it's just not worth taking. You can take them and experiment with them, and I'm a huge fan of the interceptors in particular, and using bombers for chaos purposes, just for sowing chaos. That's kind of fun too, but that's really the realm of either Oberon or Jupiter Arms, not so much with a Kula Vector. A Kula Vector, we are looking at, of course, Plasma Broadside, if you want to just deliver the damage in a quick spike. And then we can take a look at Ballistic Broadside. Now, Ballistic Broadside seems much better on paper than plasma broadside, but there's subtle differences. Plasma broadside delivers more damage, but takes longer to cool down. Ballistic broadside has an only 8-second cooldown, delivers less damage, but should have more DPS, but not. You see, it takes ballistic broadside longer to fire the guns, about 4 to 5 seconds before it starts to cool down again. So its total activation plus cooldown is about 13 seconds. And then your plasma broadside takes about 2 seconds to negotiate all the projectiles coming from it, and you add that to the cooldown that comes out to 18 seconds. But plasma broadside has a 50% more damage buff. But the range on ballistic broadside is a little better. So, how do we use these Matthias Alpha? How do we use these DREC? Here's how you use them. If you're in there and you have a really good sustaining build, you like to be in the thick of it, you are specifically built to stay in the fight as long as possible, and you have a healer nearby, or you're using both armor modules, or you have defense against disruption, ballistic broadside plus retaliator is slightly more efficient. It has slightly longer range, slightly more damage over time. You're firing it more because retaliator is knocking the cooldown to 4 seconds. Or if you absorb a nuke, it cancels the cooldown and it's ready to use immediately. I've had that where I fired the ballistic broadside, got hit by a nuke, and then fired the ballistic broadside again, took some more damage, and fired the ballistic broadside 4 seconds later for 27,000 damage in the span of about 8 to 10 seconds while the guns are blazing and while the missiles and torpedoes are flying. But if you want to jump in and jump out, or you're Oberon, or you're a fast Voronezh and you want to fly in and fly out, plasma broadside delivers quicker spike damage, especially if you don't have retaliator yet. It's worth taking. Let's take a look at the Starling missile salvo. It never hits anything. Don't take it. You can take it, and 1 out of 100 times you use it, you're going to get the most spectacular nuke and kill 3 guys. But you want something more consistent than that. Starling missile salvo is really about suppression and knocking out pods. It's about hitting things in a wide area, and they're notoriously bad on space maps. On Ixion, on Rings of Saturn, they're just awful. You really want to use it in a closely packed area that's really dense. You want to aim it at a command ship on Amirani. You want to aim it in space dock if everyone's hiding behind the central docking structure. And you want to hit 6-7 guys, clear the whole things of pods, and maybe get 1 lucky kill. But Nuke is going to do that better. Nuke is not going to be as blanketing as Starling salvo, but it really just does it better. Starling is alright, but Nuke does it better. Tartarus missile hasn't changed. You use Tartarus missile in conjunction with team efforts, and of course we have scattergun broadside, which you should ignore. Secondary on tier 4. Heavy torpedo. Please ignore it, throw it out, pretend it doesn't exist. Flechette missiles. They lose their luster in tier 4. They're not worth taking. Scroat uses flechettes because he did his advanced analytical number crunching, and it came out with this nice little ticket out of the gears and the electrodes and vacuum tubes. And this ticket said that flechette missiles do X amount of damage per time per range, and he likes that. My experience is they're not as good as light missiles, but we'll see what happens. Light missiles is one of my picks for tier 4. The range is great, 4,000 meters. Also, if you've been using light torpedoes, sometimes they go out the side of your ship and hit terrain by accident. It's very annoying, and then you have to wait another minute for them to cool down. It's the only real flaw with light torpedoes. Light missiles fire fast. They travel fast. 20 missiles, overwhelming missile defenses. They fire straight up and over very quickly, going from you to 4,000 meters out in just mere seconds. Very, very little time for your target to react. They do 12,000 damage. It's really solid. 40-second cooldown. That's really great. And if you're taking a lot of damage and you have Retaliator, that goes down to 20 seconds. Really efficient missiles, not quite as efficient as flechettes if you crunch the numbers, but I'm thinking more from math's world, math. The reality is you're not going to press the button exactly like Scroat because you're not as good. You're not going to have the perfect timing. You want a little flexibility. That 4,000 meters gives you that range and flexibility. The cooldown isn't quite as low as flechettes. Flechette missiles have a 28-second cooldown. With Retaliator, and you're taking a lot of damage on your shields, you're looking at 14 seconds. That's almost like a destroyer torpedo module. So good. But you're going to be distracted pressing other buttons, and things are going to be happening. You want a little bit of flexibility. Light missiles are solid, give you the flexibility. They kill corvettes almost as good as light torpedoes. I highly recommend light missiles. If you're really good and you have really good reflexes, flechettes are really good too. And light torpedoes are really good. Triad pods. Not on the Voronezh. And we'll get into triad pods when we get into Jupiter arms. So for the Voronezh, you're really looking at light missiles, light torpedoes, or flechettes in certain circumstances if you're really good. Stay away from strike craft. Use your broadsides, use your nukes, whichever ones you're comfortable with. Repeater guns are an option for a cool vector, but heavy flak is just as good. Stasis is still good, anti-missile is still good, but you really want to be using armor booster pulse and armor amplifier in tier 4. And then when you get to tier 5, you can experiment all you want with the Zeme. But you're a tier 4 Voronezh. You are the underdog in legendary mode. You're not a Zeme yet. You want to take it easy, have as much defense as possible. One last thing I want to get into on the Voronezh before we move on to the Lorica is that we have Last Resort, and Last Resort is really interesting on some artillery cruiser builds, but it's not worth taking. You have to get Last Resort to get the Zeme. So get it and tuck it away into your officer briefing collection and save it for artillery cruisers, because it's not going to do you any good on the Voronezh or really any other dreadnought, to be honest. So there you have it. Now let's take a look at the Lorica. The Lorica has Module Recycler. Module Recycler is really, really good for several ships. None of them are dreadnoughts, though. Again, you have to take this officer briefing, you have to research it to get to the Invictus. And it has its uses, especially on other Oberon ships. It's very, very useful for multiple reasons. You have Oberon corvettes that count on their modules to finish off their enemies because their main guns are kind of lackluster and they're a little slow. Module Recycler helps get your modules back faster if you use Blast Pulse or Torpedo Salvo. It is absolutely essential on anything that uses Assault Blink Warp, or if you're a Vindicta or Brutus using rams. Very, very handy to have. Very excellent officer briefing to have in your collection. It's worth having, but it's just not worth taking on the Lorica. The Lorica, you could take repeater guns. You start out with them, but I would really go with flak because your main guns are really, really good. They're really, really, really good. I would take flak guns with the Lorica, use your main guns at all ranges, and then when something gets too close or you sneak up on someone at close range, flak guns are going to give you that spike of damage that you need. Well, what do we use here? Well, I don't want to cut Oberon short, but we already did a pretty comprehensive module overview, and really the same thing applies. The Lorica is an underdog in Legendary, and the real time to experiment with assault thrusters and be the super quick demon that goes around and surprises everyone. Artillery cruisers are like, oh my god, there's a Lorica or there's an Invictus next to me. The time to do that's tier 5. Okay? You can experiment in tier 4, but you're probably going to die a lot more often. So you really want to be doing the same principle of alternating Armor Booster Pulse and Armor Amplifier, or using Armor Amplifier in tight spots and then using Stasis Pulse, so when you sneak up on someone, you can stasis and freeze them, deliver your firepower and get out. Or if someone's trying to chase you down, Stasis Pulse them and then get away. Very, very useful on the Lorica. Tractor Beam, still pretty useful, but not as good as tier 5. but still okay. But it just doesn't have the range that Tier 5 does. So my advice, stick with Armor Booster Pulse and alternate it with Armor Amplifier, and you're just as tough as any other Dreadnought using those modules at that moment. You're only taking 4% damage with Armor Amplifier, even less when you have your shields up, and of course you have Armor Booster Pulse to fill in the gaps. Two very good modules that make you just as good as any other Dreadnought, but now you have the speed for tactical flexibility, and you have the gun firepower to duke it out at medium to long and even close ranges. It's a very, very good Dreadnought. You have the same secondary module options. You can use Vulture missiles and Strikecraft, and we'll get into that in a second, to tag people at long range, stay out of the thick of it, and stay at far away ranges, and still have the armor boosting modules to back you up when someone closes in on you or to get away. Or you can get in there, sneak in there, use your Armor Booster Pulse and Armor Amplifier to absorb firepower to deliver light torpedoes or flechettes or light missiles, or even sneak into Triad Pods. We're going to get more into Triad Pods when we get into Jupiter Arms, but now know that you could have a build where you sneak in, drop Triad Pods, and start a big furball where there's a big cloud of hands and fists and a big fight, and you're the guy that crawls out of the bottom of the screen off to the side. You can go in, absorb firepower, drop Triad Pods off, stasis pulse everyone, and then get out. Use your engine power to get out. But that's more of a Tier 5 thing. You can practice it in Tier 4. Really, you want to focus on the same things that the Aquila Vector Dreadnought does, the Voronezh at Tier 4, but now you have a little bit of speed at the sacrifice of some hull. But at 50,000 hull, you're only a little less than the Voronezh. You're still pretty good, and you have a little more speed, but it's not the speed of a Corvette or even of a destroyer. For your navigation officer briefing, I still recommend slow and steady. You have a maneuverability rating of 37. Minus 3 or 4 brings you down to like 33, 34. That's still comparatively fast. And when you activate your Armor Amplifier plus Engineering 101, you really are going to be pretty darn invincible. Not perfectly invincible, but close to there. As it was for your engineering officer briefing, I actually recommend Engineering 101 on the Lorca and Invictus because you may not want the extra power at the sacrifice of hull. You may just want to be as close to invulnerable as possible, so maybe Get Your Good Side isn't as good on Oberon Dreadnoughts. As far as your primary weapon, you can do the same thing as far as broadsides that the Aquila Vector Dreadnoughts do. You also have the option of nuking at long range where it's safe, but now you have Strikecraft. I don't recommend fighters, ever. I have tried so hard, along with especially the Germans, along with many other players experimenting with fighters. It's just not very good. It's very hard to use effectively, and it never works out the way you intend. So I recommend using interceptors. They do really good damage. Sometimes they get shot down, but if you're not in the thick of it, where they don't get shot down as soon as they leave your ship, if you're far away, maybe 5,000 to 6,000 meters, suppressing people with your guns, perfect time to use interceptors. You also have the maneuverability to get to the flanks where people don't see the interceptors coming and they don't shoot them down. Very good against artillery cruisers. Interceptors are really good on Oberon ships, and they have a fairly short cooldown at 40 seconds, so when you do get into the thick of it, you can launch them more often. And of course you have bombers to troll people. You can kite the enemy, stay on the borders of the map, shooting them at medium to long range, and launch bombers to sow confusion, and then your team members can really clean up. So Strikecraft is the way to go, in my opinion, with Oberon. But if you don't like Strikecraft, you can still use broadsides and nukes just as effectively as Aquila Vector, and you can use all the same weaponry as Aquila Vector. It's just you're a little less resilient, but have maneuverability to get in and get out of combat a little better. I wouldn't recommend jumping. I wouldn't recommend rupture ammo, any of that. It's just not going to help you. If you really want to be a team player, don't use rupture ammo, use Tartarus missile. Okay? That way, I've heard players say, oh, you want to use rupture ammo, get in there, hit someone with rupture ammo, and your team can capitalize and you get out. You're probably not going to get out. You have 50,000 hull. You're probably going to get killed. Use Tartarus missile to disable certain opponents. Your team can capitalize, and you still have armor amplifier to get out of the fight safely. So the Lorca is a great ship, and we'll get into that in a little bit as far as my recommendation for Tier 4. Now let's look at the game-changing Dreadnought from Jupiter Arms. The first Dreadnought offered for Jupiter Arms is at Tier 4, and that is the mighty Jutland. So what makes the Jutland so special? Well, it's slow. It's so slow. It is so unbelievably slow. The maneuverability rating is 20. What does that mean? That means you need to have slow and steady on the Jutland. Why? Because you go from speed 20 to 18. I've heard so many players say, oh, I want to make the Jutland fast, and then it'll be the fast Jutland. It's not going to happen. Plus 10% is going to bring you to 22. You're still so slow. And then assault thrusters are going to be like, oh, okay, I'm going to move twice as fast. Well, moving twice as fast for a few seconds, you go like 40 for a couple seconds, and then you're back to being slow. So go ahead, put slow and steady on it, even for my super brick build in which I don't jump around. And I only use that build on certain maps where I don't have to travel very far to fight, or that I know people are going to be coming after me. So I use slow and steady, and you should too, on your Jupiter Arms Dreadnoughts. What are we looking for as far as weaponry? Well, in the old days it used to be repeater guns because you could never get into flak range. Even if you jumped in, they could just fly away from flak range. And your primary guns used to be awful, but they got a serious buff, and now the primary weaponry of the Monarch and the Jutland is really good. It does really good damage, on par with flak guns, except it has up to 5,000 range. The drawback is it has 5,000 range. So you really need something, either ignore targets outside of 5,000 range or use mortars in Tier 5. We'll get into that in a little bit. But really, you want to use your main guns at all ranges and occasionally use flak turrets when your guns are reloading and you're in very close range. What do we got over here as far as officer briefing? Well, this thing we've been talking about this entire episode, and that's Retaliator. What does Retaliator do? Shield takes damage, reduce module cooldowns. That doesn't sound very impressive. It sounds like I would do better with Communications 101. Well, you won't. Retaliator is awesome. Whenever you're shooting a Dreadnought and it has armor amp up, and you see a little green clock below the health bar, and then a couple seconds later it activates armor amplifier again, and you're like, what is going on? This thing is impossible to kill. That's Retaliator. Retaliator, every time you take damage, takes about a second. No matter how much damage you take some damage to your shields, it takes at least a second off all your cooldowns. If you absorb a lot of damage on your shields, like a missile salvo, a torpedo salvo, or an Athos shoots you a whole bunch for 10 seconds, you're taking 10 to 15 seconds off the cooldowns, all your cooldowns for all your modules. Or you take a nuke to the face. A nuke drops, you put up your shields. You might as well take 20-30 seconds every nuke you absorb off all your cooldowns. It's really impressive. And then when two Dreadnoughts go at it with Retaliator, it is pure comedy to watch because they are just hammering on each other's shields and activating all sorts of modules. And I've had matches where me and other Dreadnoughts have gone toe-to-toe in the center of the map, and everyone basically ignores us because we're just going to hammer on each other for literally 2 to 3 minutes. It's an eternity. It's great. You really want Retaliator no matter which Dreadnought you like, no matter which company you go with. You want to at least grab the Jutland and get Retaliators, get 20,000 experience, even save your free XP. Get the Jutland, buy it, and then drop the Jutland if you don't like the Jutland. If you don't want to play the Jutland, get Retaliator, save up your free XP, spend 20,000, get Retaliator, be done with it. But you need Retaliator for all your other Dreadnoughts, and you especially need it for the Jutland and Monarch. What makes the Jutland so groundbreaking? It's so slow, and its guns are pretty good, Okay, no big deal. It has 80,000 hull points. The Monarch has 90,000. But with 80,000 hull points, that is so much. It's the first Dreadnought that really doesn't need to use armor amplifier. If someone disrupts you and does a lot of damage to you, you don't care. For my super brick build, in which I didn't jump around, people would disrupt me, I would throw up my shields, and Retaliator would get me my armor amplifiers back, and even if they rammed me, I would take 20,000 damage and still be at the same amount of hull as a fresh Voronezh. That's impressive. That's really strong. It has so much hull. It offers so much flexibility. So you can do the super brick, but you're not going to get many kills because people are eventually just going to leave you alone. So what do most players do? They do the jumping Jutland. So we go down here and we have our jump 4. You can target allies and enemies, and that's key because you want to target your enemies at 5,000 meters or less, jump in on them, do a whole bunch of damage, and then have a cooldown of 25 seconds. As you're taking damage, your Retaliator, that's really about 15 seconds, so you only have to survive for 15 seconds. And right about the 10-second mark, after you've killed your target, look for the closest healer, charge your warp jump, get out, get to the healer, they heal you up, rinse, repeat. Really, unless you're doing the super brick build, which I don't even recommend, I only do that to troll certain players. For the most part, the Jutland is about jumping. It changes the game for Dreadnoughts because now Dreadnoughts don't have to cross the battlefield. And this is the Dreadnought that you don't have to make the agonizing decision, do I survive with armor amp or do I jump to gain surprise? Now you have the hull along with the shields to survive very violent engagements. So you really want Warp Jump 4. Warp Jump 3 is what comes on the Jutland. The first thing you want to change out is get Warp Jump 4. You want to be able to target enemies, get to them, take them out, and then target friendlies and jump back. So, what do we have for proximity? Well, anti-missile lasers are at the bottom of the list for a reason. They really don't help you. You're going to be absorbing so much firepower at close range. Maybe they'll help with disruptor missiles, but you don't care about disruptor missiles because you're jumping. So it really doesn't matter. You have the hull to absorb the firepower, and along with shields, it's great. So there's two real philosophies here. And I personally use Armor Booster Pulse because you jump in, activate Armor Booster Pulse, and basically for the entire time you're in until I jump out, I take 50% less damage along with Retaliator that's 60% less damage. Throw your shields up that absorb an additional 65% damage. You're really taking a little less than 1/3 damage, and with 80,000 hull, that's going to last you a long time, at least long enough to jump out. But the other philosophy is to use Stasis Pulse, so when you jump in, things don't get away. You jump in, stasis 3-4 players, you focus one down, do damage to a second, and meanwhile, all the artillery cruisers and destroyers on your team are shooting the other guys you're ignoring that you stasised. And of course, with only a 30-second cooldown, if you stay in the fight and take a lot of damage on your shields, which you probably will, you can stasis things again on the way out. And that's really cool. And stasis goes into Triad Pods. Triad Pods. I've been talking about them this very long but informative video, and now we're finally going to get into them. What are they? They got a buff about 5-6 months ago. They have a lifetime of 20 seconds, 3 of them launch, and they have a minute cooldown. That seems like a lot, but when you launch them, they shoot at, kind of like short-range artillery pods, they shoot at the closest thing within 2,000 meters, and they do 2550 DPS, 2,500 damage per second. And if you've ever been hit with the purple spam of Triad Pods, you know how deadly they absolutely are. And if you have Retaliator up, you can jump in, launch the Triad Pods. As soon as those Triad Pods, it takes about 2 to 3 seconds for Triad Pods to set into place. As soon as you see the flash and they set into place, you stasis everybody. And then you jump out. And the triad pods sit there shooting everything for 20 seconds. And since stasis pulse keeps everything locked down to, 6 to 8 seconds with a good radius and keeps them almost completely frozen, wow. After the stasis pulse wears off, they're going to try to start moving again, but they're still going to be in range of triad pods for a couple seconds. It's going to be absolutely devastating. And if you are having a good run and you jump in and people will do the stupid thing of ignoring you, you can launch triad pods, stasis people, take some damage on your shields, stasis them again, and then launch triad pods again and then jump out. And it's absolutely devastating. It's so much fun. Alternatives to this is, of course, light missiles or flechettes. When I jump in, I use light missiles or triad pods, and other players use flechettes because they have a very low cooldown. They're very efficient as far as damage on paper. But triad pods are a lot of fun. You should definitely pick them up and bring them into Tier 5. But I highly recommend light missiles and flechettes. Light torpedoes are really good up until this point, but with the Jutland, you have to wait way too long to use them, and they just don't do enough damage compared to triad pods or missiles. They're not really the way to go, but you can pick them up if you want. If you're jumping in, I don't recommend using nukes. Some players do. I don't recommend it. I recommend using broadsides. If you're doing a super brick build in which it's a very small map and you're not jumping around and you're impossible to kill, strike craft are highly recommended because they can reach out and touch people on the other side of the map and do tremendous damage. But if you're jumping around, don't use strike craft, don't use nukes. You want to be using the broadside. And like we went over it before, depending on what you're using, what your build and what your style is, you want to be using either ballistic or plasma broadside. You don't want to be using the scattergun broadside. So that about does it for the Jutland, and it's a one-of-a-kind ship. It really does make the whole warp jumping dreadnought thing feasible and effective. And all the good jumping Jutlands and all the good jumping Monarchs have very similar builds, and they really change the state of the game. So what do I recommend for Tier 4? The Jutland is pretty awesome, but it takes you a while to get to that awesome level, and it doesn't have the maximum hull to be the best jumper in the game yet. So I actually give it to the Lorica. When I was in Tier 4 and doing the Lorica, I was getting some great results. The Jutland is tough, but it's just not tough enough yet. It's still effective, but it will die. You're probably at best going to get a 4-to-1 kill ratio with it. Probably more like 2 to 3 to 1. And the Voronezh is solid. Akula Vector is going to be solid in all these categories. You can't go wrong with Akula Vector. It's a decent, solid ship, but nothing really stands apart with it. I'm going to give it to the Lorica. The Lorica has the speed, and using armor amplification, has the survivability to get in and get out of trouble, to take advantage of the tactical situation. It's a really, really good ship in Tier 4. Very survivable, very flexible, very fast. So let's get into Tier 5. Tier 5 Legendary Mode, the ultimate for Dreadnoughts. And let's start out with the Monarch. And the Monarch is going to be my pick for Tier 5. There's going to be no suspense about it. I mean, L-Smoke, Fiery Titan, everyone that pulls out in a Monarch is doing serious damage. And it's not because it's easy. You need skill to use the Monarch, but the jumping Monarch is so savage. It has 90,000 hull. And if you use Reinforced and counter it with Retaliator, which I don't necessarily recommend, but it's worth trying, you can actually get to 106,000 hull. Over 100,000 hull on the Monarch. You jump in, you have full shields ready to go. If you want to stay in the fight, you use Armor Booster Pulse. If you want to get in, get out, you use Stasis Pulse. There's really no other module worth using unless you want to do Super Brick, which is Armor Amplifier, and Super Brick's only usable on like 2 maps. You want to warp jump, you either want to use Armor Booster Pulse or Stasis Pulse. You want to use triad pods if you're using stasis pulse. If you're using armor booster pulse, you want to use flechettes or light missiles. And you want to use plasma broadside or ballistic broadside. And then you can try to use mortar at long range. Your guns are limited to 5,000 meters. Mortars go very, very far, out to 8,000 meters, but they're particularly hard to hit. So it's really you're just launching random mortars until you jump into someone. I recommend flak. Flak does really good damage at close range at this tier. I don't recommend repeaters anymore. They're just not worth it for the Monarchs. You want to go with flak or experiment with heavy mortars at long range. But rinse, repeat. It's a fun ship. If you don't do it right and you don't work on your timing, you're going to die a lot. But if you use terrain to your advantage, use surprise, you can get in there and do serious damage. You've seen some of the replays. It's devastating. A Monarch can be devastating. And if your team isn't, even if they're randoms, if they are at least of average intelligence and skill, they're going to capitalize on the tremendous distraction and disruption that you are bringing to the battlefield. It really is, overall, the most exciting, the most awesome, the most scary, and the most effective Dreadnought. It really gets you into the thick of it, and if you play well, it has tremendous results. It's got to be the best ship to use in Tier 5, but I'm not selling the other ships short. So let's go back to Aquila Vector and see what they can do in Tier 5. A lot of the gameplay is going to remain the same as we've gone through in the previous tiers, but the Zemay has a little bit more hull now. Its guns are a little more powerful, and they do snipe pretty well at long range. They have 68,000 hull points. That's very competitive with the Jutland and the Monarch. It has access to armor booster pulse and armor amplifier, and it has the speed to get in there and get out. And of course you have the options of using the nukes, the broadsides, or even using interceptors or bombers. Remember, I would stay away from scattergun broadside. I'd stay away from fighters. But you can have a lot of fun and flexibility with the Zemay. It has the hull to get you through. It has the defensive modules to get you through. At this point, unless you're trying something super crazy, I don't recommend stasis. I don't recommend these auto guns. But tractor beam is very interesting indeed. On the Zemay, you can forego armor booster pulse because you have the additional 8,000 hull now and the additional 25 power to your shields. You can use armor amplifier and use it more often if you have retaliator, and have a nice pillow of hull to get you through when it's on cooldown, and you can suck people right in with this tractor beam. Look at this tractor beam. Tractor beam strength is 0.9. It means that it is almost as strong as engines when you're not using power to engines. And it has a 20-second duration, 5,000 meters, and only a 40-second cooldown. So as you're dragging things in and they're shooting your shields, the cooldown goes down. So it lasts for 20 seconds. You're dragging them in, and then a couple seconds after it wears off, you can either drag them in again or drag someone else in. You know, it's so much fun. It's very hard to get away from. The only way to really get away from it is to fly down or fly up and get terrain between you and it. It's very hard to power out of a tractor beam. It really, really is. In certain builds, I could be ruling the map and doing really good, and then I get hit with a tractor beam and my kill streak is over. Especially if you're smart. And in the Zemay, if you're not jumping around, you're in the center of a formation next to a healer, protecting the healer with your body because you can't use armor booster pulse. And the healer is protecting you as well, and you're staying near other ships, and when you take damage, heavy damage, you get armor amplifier, and then you use tractor beam and you drag ships in, and your friends are like, oh look, you know, it's like you just brought them a pizza, or you just put the Thanksgiving turkey on the table. Yeah, they love it. They really appreciate it. It's very powerful, highly recommended. In fact, probably for the Zemay, not the Jutland or the Monarch. For the Zemay, I recommend it more than Stasis Pulse. So Tractor Beam is the way to go. And Tractor Beam combos well into Triad Pods, because you can suck them in. Triad pods will do a lot of damage. But, of course, you can also use missiles with the Zeme. They're really good for mid-range brawling, especially the light missiles. Or if you're sick of getting shot at long range, you can use vulture missiles. They're pretty handy. They're not the best, but they will hit things far away. But I would actually probably recommend interceptors for that more. But if you don't like using strike craft and you want that close range brawling potential, or you want to use a nuke, remember, if you're working with other players in a Zeme, a Tartarus missile is a pretty good idea, especially to help take down those really annoying tactical cruisers. Or you could just use the normal nuke if you get really good at using it. But a lot of Zeme captains really like the broadsides. But if you're in the center of a formation and you're not taking a lot of damage, the nuke's the way to go. Strikecraft's the way to go. If you like brawling, you get into the center of the brawl. You can use Armor Booster, Pulse Armor Amplifier. If you're being the center of a formation protecting tacticals, you can use nuke, tractor beam, missiles, or light torpedoes, and of course use Armor Amplifier. It's a good ship. And at Tier 5, you can experiment with Assault Thrusters because it makes you just fast enough. If you use, instead of using Slow and Steady, which I recommend for most builds, if you use Nerves of Steel and Assault Thrusters, you'd be surprised how fast the Zeme goes. And you can speed around the battlefield and take a lot of people by surprise, hit them with the very stealthy light torpedoes, finish them off with a plasma broadside, or fly around the map and use Strikecraft. It's very, very handy. Very interesting indeed. Worth playing with. I would stay away from Rupture Ammo or Offensive Lockdown, and you can make a fairly decent Zeme jumping build if you don't have the Monarch or the Jutland. You can make a makeshift warp build. You're not going to be as good as Jupiter Arms at it, but if you have a secondary build with that on there, and there's like 3 artillery cruisers sniping everyone along range, you can sneak around terrain and all of a sudden jump in on them and just do a suicide run and take all 3 of them out, and then get your team the breathing room they need to get into medium and close range. Now, let's take a look at the Invictus. The Invictus, like the Lorica, is competitive and comparable, but it just doesn't have the hull of the Monarch or the Zeme. I mean, the Lorica was good, very competitive, fast enough so that it can stay out of trouble and survive brawls with Tier 5s, but the Invictus just, oh man, it has 50,000 hull, and its speed isn't any faster than the Lorica. So I actually think the Lorica, for what it is better at Tier 4 than the Invictus is at Tier 5. I still use the Invictus. It's still a lot of fun. And you can, at this point, try the Assault Thrusters. It makes you really fast, and it's really comical, and it's really fun, and you get some really interesting kills. But Assault Thrusters are almost better on the Zeme, to be honest. You can do it on the Invictus. I've seen some outrageously fast builds, but they're more or less suicide builds. The Invictus has just enough speed, even if you use Slow and Steady, to be tactically flexible. It uses Strikecraft really well. You can sneak up on people, drop Triad pods, run away while you're delivering broadsides. Or you can stay at arm's length, use interceptors, vulture missiles, sneak up on people, and use light missiles. But really, the staple for the Invictus is Armor Amplifier. You only have 50,000 hull. It's not much at all. It's nowhere near 68, and it's not even close to 80 or 90,000. In fact, if you put reinforced officer briefing on the Monarch has more than double your hull. And you're not much faster than the Monarch. You are, but not really. So Armor Amplifier is the way to go. It really is. If you want to throw caution to the wind, you can use Nerves of Steel and use power to engines and get really quick bursts of speed to get away. When people are shooting you, you're at half health, your Armor Amplifier wore off, and you don't have much shields left, put power to engines and take some shots to the butt, and you will propel yourself almost like an evasive maneuver and maybe get away. But it's an act of desperation. I personally like to alternate armor amplifier and armor booster pulse. It's very effective, and I have just enough speed to get away. I like to use strike craft, but also broadsides are really good if you're speeding around the map. I don't recommend warp jump. There's really no point. If you're going to warp jump, do it on a Jupiter Arms or maybe a Cooler Vector in certain cases. If you warp jump in an Invictus, it's like delivering yourself into the teeth of the enemy. It's not worth it. If you want to be fast, use assault thrusters, but you can get around pretty quick with power to engines, and you have armor amplifier, armor booster pulse. You can even throw caution to the wind and use engine rigor if you already have the officer briefing from other Oberon ships like the Vindicta, and burn all your power speeding around with engine rigor and power to engines, and then when you're out of power you can throw up your armor defenses. That's a strategy. So you have a lot of flexibility with the Invictus. I would use the heavy flak turrets, of course, and either use nukes and long-range missiles at long range, or if you want to sneak in and do a medium range brawl, you can use either plasma broadside or ballistic broadside, and of course missiles and torpedoes. Or you can use triad pods for comedy's sake. Just sneak in, use them, get out. That works well with assault thrusters, but you really want to make a quick delivery and then get the heck out of there, because with 50,000 hull you're not going to last that long. But the guns on the Invictus are very impressive. I use the Invictus to just speed around normally. It's pretty fast. And I use Nerves of Steel. On certain builds, I also use slow and steady, but you use Nerves of Steel, power to engines, and you get away pretty quick. I use armor booster pulse, armor amplifier, alternate them. And, of course, you could go in and use stasis pulse instead. Go in, activate armor amplifier when you take damage, stasis pulse to freeze them, drop off triad pods, and use Nerves of Steel and power to engines to get away. Or you can kite the map and use vultures and strike craft, and when you get into trouble, use armor amplifier, or maybe even use a tractor beam to draw people close to you. If you're behind the rest of your team, draw people close into the rest of your team. But if you do that, make sure you keep a good distance between you and the enemy. So overall, I have to give it to the Monarch in Tier 5, but that about goes over the entirety of Dreadnoughts. And I do know that this one was a little longer than Destroyers, but there's so much to go over and a lot of important information, especially with officer briefings. I couldn't do this episode of Legendary Journey justice if I didn't go over officer briefings and some of the finer points of using Dreadnoughts properly, because of all the ships, they can be the most unforgiving, and sometimes it really drags your gameplay down, and it really is demoralizing to pick up this big, mighty, pretty battleship that you love and want to hug and just really dig, and you go into battle and you just get taken out by a Corvette or a destroyer, or you get overwhelmed by 3-4 ships, and you're like, well, what good is this big hunk of junk if it dies so easily? That's why I wanted to give you the information that you need so that you have a more pleasant Dreadnought experience, and that when you pull out your favorite Dreadnought, you really live up to the game's name and are an unstoppable, unsinkable battleship. Well, that's it from me for now, and I'll see you soon in Sinley Bay.